Hello ladies and gentlemen, GabeStay here. This is the Heroic Quick Raid Guide for Thok the Bloodthirsty. And as usual, if you're looking for a more detailed guide, you can check out the full raid guide by clicking on the yellow annotation in the bottom left there. So the first big concern for this fight is healing the Deafening Screech damage for the normal phase of the fight. So a few things to keep in mind are that you need to have good positions and setups for your raid composition. I talk in detail about raid composition options in the full guide if you're looking for that section. But suffice to say, we decided to go with 3 healers and 2 tanks, which offered a nice balance between output of our heals as well as stability and overall DPS against the boss. The best thing you can do, in my opinion, is to try to push for high stack counts of the acceleration, or basically a long normal phase during the first and the third normal phases, shortening the second and the fourth phases in that process. If you do this, you can use your major cooldowns, raid cooldowns for the first and the third, and push them longer, whereas the second and fourth are invariably going to be shorter because of the mechanics involved. Now the next consideration is the order of cages that you activate, and we use a method that's pretty standard. I think most raids do this as well. The first cage is the front left one as you're coming into the room, which is the green cage. Second is blue in the front right, and then finally the third cage is the back right, or red cage. The reason for this order primarily is due to the bats that spawn, which we'll talk about in a moment, which is an addition on Heroic. And these will appear during the first cage opening, so this is tying into the cooldown usage that I talked about before, where you extend your first normal phase and your third normal phase, whereas the second and the fourth, which would be after opening the first cage, the green cage on the left, and the third cage, the red one on the right, those 2 phases are shortened. And that will overall balance out pretty well for your raid survival and cooldown usage. So pretty simple. Front left, green first, front right, blue second, and back right, red third. Now the first major addition and the most important change is the addition of captive cave bats on this fight. These will spawn shortly after you open the green cage on the left, the first cage usually, and these will come down from the left side of the room. There you can see them flying in. These have normal threat. They need to be picked up by one of your tanks, and they need to be killed off very quickly. These act just like the cave bats that you saw during the trash just before the boss, in that after a few seconds, a few of them will randomly start to shoot out vampiric bolts. You can see them flying there momentarily. These bolts, in addition to doing damage to the raid members that get targeted, also heal up the bats. So the best thing you can do, in addition to burning them down, is when you see bolts being fired off, use area of effect stuns on the bats. While stunned, this will interrupt their bolt casting, and it will save a lot of damage. This phase, the normal green phase after opening the cage with the bats, is by far the most dangerous phase that you'll face in terms of incoming damage and spike potential on the raid. So it's really important that you kill the bats quickly and efficiently, and then you can push out of the phase once the bats are dead or mostly dead. If you're just learning this, your DPS is a little low, you might find it's easier to actually end the phase while the bats are still alive. And that's perfectly acceptable to do, especially while you're learning. Just push further in the fight. But after a while, you'll kind of get used to the pattern. And especially if you're using 2 tanks, it's pretty easy to have the second tank pick a position that they can stack up with the raid, not threaten to transition the phase too early, and the melee and DPS can cleave the bats down pretty quickly. The only other addition on Heroic is the Starved Yeti ad. Again, this Yeti acts very similar to the Yeti you see in the trash before the boss, and it will spawn shortly after you open the front right cage, or the blue cage. So there you can see the Yeti in the background running across. And he will just basically run to opposite sides of the room somewhat randomly and use his sort of wrecking ball ability, so that anyone he touches pretty much gets one shot by him if they're in the same path. So the best thing you can do on this phase, if you're positioned properly, which you see here, kind of near the cage, if he comes toward your group, then you probably have to move into melee range. If anyone's too far out in this position, will get clipped by him. But otherwise, he's not very threatening. For the most part, when you're first getting into this fight and progression, you're going to need all the DPS you can get on the boss, which means you can't really afford to kill the Yeti. So once the Yeti appears after you open the second cage, you pretty much ignore him from then on. The only thing you have to do is just be aware that he's rushing across and kind of look at where he is and the marker, the red marker that he puts along the opposite wall that indicates where he's going. Make sure you're not in that path so he doesn't hit you, and otherwise he can be pretty much ignored the entire time. So mechanically it's not too difficult. Here you can see him about to charge across, and no one's in his path, so we're completely safe from him for another 10-15 seconds or so. So that's it. It's pretty simple, a mechanic to deal with in addition, and like I said, the cave bats are much more dangerous than the Yeti is. So this phase overall is much simpler than the one prior that you faced. Now, because this is a quick guide, I'm not going to go into very much detail about overall positions and kiting. Again, if you want the full details, there's a top-down animation that I created for the full guide. Just click on that red raid annotation in the bottom left there. And then in the description of the full guide video, click on the positions and kiting link, which is like 14 minutes into it or so. Basically, that will give you a full animation that shows you exactly how the positioning for the normal phases works, as well as the positions, or paths rather, for the kite phases here. But that said, I'll briefly explain what we're doing with the footage here you see. So for kiting, the basic idea is we start near one of the front cages, whichever one we happen to be near at that start of the phase. The first two kiting players move the boss to the opposite wall. So basically you move toward the cage that's on the other side of the room. So if you're starting on the front left cage, the blue one, first two kiters go toward the front right cage along that wall. And then the third kiter goes to the opposite wall from where the first two kiters went. Then the fourth kiter goes up the hall toward the entrance of the room, so to my right here, which is kind of where I'm starting to go in case I get picked. And then the final fifth kiter goes to the back of the room, behind where the boss initially spawns in this room. And then by the time he finishes the fifth kite, the next cage should be opened by your tank, and you proceed with the next phase. So again, it's basically, if you're on the left cage, the front left, then the first two kiters go to the right along that wall, and then opposite for the third, up the hall to the entrance to the fourth, and back of the room to the fifth. And that's pretty much the kite method. For normal positioning of this boss, the main idea is to use the corner markers indicated by the inner circle that are around the room. So when you enter the room itself, here you can see the markers set up. We basically put markers on the opposite sides of those two corners of the inner circle. So there you can see blue and green next to that corner, and then purple and red on the other corner on the right. And by putting your groups of 4 on each of these markers, they're far enough away to not trigger the phase accidentally, but you can use the healing radius of things like healing rains or efflorescence from druids and hit everyone involved in the raid. So it's very efficient for healing and good positions to attack the boss. So those are the basics of positions and kiting. And again, if you want much more detail in the animated thing, you can check that out in the full guide there. Now, the final thing to discuss is how to up your DPS during the kite phase. So the main thing to do is essentially to allow your melee DPS, however many you have, to attack the boss for the first 3 kites or so, the first 3 kite targets during any given kite phase. Because the boss is so slow for the first few, and if you're cutting him around in the same pattern that we're using, so he stays somewhat in the main room, your melee should be able to keep up with him. As long as they stay behind the boss, for the most part, they'll be safe. And as long as they watch where new fixate targets are, angled, so basically they watch where the red beam is indicating where the boss will face next, they shouldn't get in front of him and they can safely attack the boss. Your range DPS, meanwhile, will be taking care of the jailer for the most part. As long as the jailer dies in time for the boss to stop his fixates and in the kite phase after the 5th fixate, then things will go great. And this is all assuming you don't have Warlock portals, which make the kiting phase much easier overall. This is the method that we used without Warlock, basically. So that's the general plan. Allow your melee DPS to attack the boss primarily for the first 2 or 3 kites, and then he's going to be too fast at that point for your melee to keep up. So range can do a little bit more to him from that point on, but otherwise you're just kind of letting him go for the last 2, and as he run past, do a bit of damage, and then wait for the next phase to begin. So that about covers everything for the quick raid guide for Thok the Bloodthirsty on Heroic. It is a very difficult fight, the most challenging up to this point on Heroic in my opinion, and it really requires that everyone in your raid be playing at top notch to kind of make progress on this fight. Healing is extremely difficult. There's a lot of dispels, positioning requirements. Players need to all be aware of the timing and potential angles of kiting and fixates and all that stuff during the kite phases. You got to watch for the basic mechanics, the new bats and the Yeti, all that good stuff. So there's a lot going on here. But just take each phase one at a time, try to push further into the fight as much as you can, and that will give you overall practice. The other thing is don't be afraid to do cages outside of the standard order to get practice on those phases. There's nothing worse than just keeping the order the same, finally getting to that red cage for the first time, and just completely having no idea what's going on. So I practice doing each of those cages in their own, outside of the normal order, just to get that particular method down a little bit and figure out, how long are we going to go on the red cage before we stack up and transition him and all that good stuff. So anyway, there's a lot more detail in the full raid guide, as I said, if you want more information. Otherwise, thanks for watching, good luck, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.